having an experience that is able to be in that person's language is going to be sticky. They're going to keep coming back, and it's going to get new people to join. Convincing other people of that, not so easy.
Zach, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Where are you located? Let's start with that.
I'm currently in San Francisco, California. I've been here for the last 10 years, but I grew up in Southern California in Los Angeles County. So I've spent my whole life in California. Grew up in Southern California, went to college way up in Northern California, almost to Oregon in Humboldt County, and then now settled here in the Bay Area for the last decade.
What did you study?
I study Spanish language.
Okay.
And international studies with an emphasis in Latin America. I'm not a native speaker of Spanish, but I am fluent in Spanish. So
fluent in tequila.
Very fluent in tequila. too fluent. But it wasn't the first thing I studied in college. Out of high school, I studied business because I don't know, business, right?
Mm-hmm. Money, yeah.
Money, right? Yeah. So the thing is, I didn't care at all. And actually didn't do very well in college at all. Had to leave a couple of times because I wasn't interested in what I was studying. Then finally, when I realized that I could study Spanish, it was something that I was good at, and hadn't really thought about doing it as a career or as a major. I went back to school, and what do you know? Everything went smoothly the rest of the way. So I studied Spanish.
So that sort of leads to localization, but I know that you didn't start in localization right away, right? No. Out of college, I actually in high school and a little bit after high school, I had done the only work experience for the most part I had was in restaurants and catering. So which actually I was able to use a decent amount of Spanish. In the back, there's definitely quite a bit of Spanish being spoken. But after I graduated, I went to work at a bar as a bar manager, or a bartender. Worked my way up to bar manager, and wasn't really sure what to do. And then the Lyft came along, and I started driving because and I know if you're in Vancouver, you just got Lyft not too long ago. Yeah. I saw the billboards everywhere. But let me pause right here, because before we go into Lyft, why did you start as a bartender? Like, didn't you think of pursuing career in what you just graduated from?
Yeah, I thought about being a translator, but I didn't really know the right people or the right avenues to go down. And to be honest, I wasn't really super driven to start my career after college. I really didn't know what to do. A little bit lost. Still trying to figure things out at the time. So, I probably could have dug in and really done some work there. But, I didn't even think about localization. I know this sounds strange, but I didn't know localization was a thing. I understood that companies offered their services or their website or their content in other languages, but that to me just was translation. I didn't really understand what the localization industry was at the time. So I think I was more just trying to make some money, try and get on my feet, and then after that, then try and figure things out. But I was more just, for lack of a better word, lazy, and wasn't trying to get off the ground just yet. So I went back to what I knew, and that's why I went into the restaurant industry.
Okay, so Lyft. You started driving.
Yes.
How do you go from a driver to a localization manager?
That is, all right. Buckle up, okay? It's no pun intended. So while I was working as a bar manager, bartender, bar manager, I started driving on the side. And this was very early. This was probably mid 2013, late 2013. And a friend of mine was telling me that, you gotta get on this. It's like a taxi, but it's not. you get this giant pink fuzzy mustache, you put it on the front of your car, and you make $45 an hour picking people up. And I'm like, what? All right, I'll give it a shot.
Was it a startup at that time?
It was. When I started driving in mid-July 2013, there were probably at headquarters, I don't know for sure, but I'd say maybe less than 100 people probably working. It had just launched as a service in August of 2012. So it was less than a year old. They were only operating in half dozen markets in the US. So it was still very, very small. And so I'd finish my shift at the bar. I'd hop in the car and I'd go out and drive and pick people up. So one night I was driving late and picked up someone who was a Lyft employee, a support team manager at the time. He and I had a good conversation. He's like, "Hey man, you seem like a normal person. Do you wanna come work for us? They were having a recruiting event for their support team at the time, and he invited me to that recruiting event, and just like that. And now he didn't offer me the job on the spot, but he offered me an invitation to the event where they were hiring people like crazy because they were seeing some pretty amazing growth at the time. And so, yeah, I interviewed a couple of times and got the job as an entry-level support associate.
What can you even remember? Like, what was your discussion when you were driving that guy? Like, what were you talking about?
So he was my neighbor at the time. So I remember picking him up somewhere downtown at a bar and driving him home, which was only a few blocks from my house. And so that was kind of the first thing we started talking about. But it was, at the time, it was much more, how do I put this? It was, people were fist bumping and it was very like cool and avant-garde to be in this Lyft. It was like better than a taxi and there was like real people. And so, you know, I think the conversation was just like, what do you do? Like, what are you into? Like, what do you like? And so it was very much like your friend with a car, which was one of Lyft's slogans very early on. So I think it was one of those things where we just had that conversation of just like, here's what I do. And then I asked him, you know, what do you do? And inevitably Lyft came up. And that's why I think, you know, my skills as being in the restaurant industry, being a bartender, you know, you want to talk to the bartender. Like you want to have that conversation. So I was a pretty good conversationalist. And I was able to endear myself enough to be able to get the invitation to the event.
Not usually, but you know, like you see the questions, like the first part is like, hey, let's get practical. Let's talk about localization. And then let's talk about your personal life. But since we're already talking about it, it's like, I don't know, I'll figure out something in the post editing, or maybe I'll just release it at once. But, you know, I also had one friend who worked as a bartender and then he worked at Global Me, like a smaller agency where he was working as a project manager on data collection. Mm. And so he told me that yes, like a lot of the people come to bar just to talk to the bartender.
Yeah.
So do you think like these skills of communication and like making people feel comfortable and opening up to you, is that something that you developed during the bartending? Or did you have like these good social skills before?
I think I had some of it before. You know, coming into it, I definitely am somewhat outgoing. Definitely like to have a conversation with people, but having so many conversations while working at the bar, I think I had a lot of practice.
Right.
And if you think about it, what are two professions that you talk to? You talk to the bartender and you talk to the taxi driver, right? And so it was kind of an interesting transition going from bar to taxi, more or less, Lyft driver. So I think those skills just transferred right over. And, you know, like at the end of the day, you know, I ended up giving almost 4,000 Lyft rides by the time I finished. I don't have a car anymore because in San Francisco, you don't really need a car. So I got rid of my car a few years ago. But by the end of it, you know, I'd given 4,000 rides. And so I picked up at least 4,000 people, actually a lot more than that, you know, if there were 2 or 3 people that got in the car. So I definitely had plenty of time to practice those conversation skills.
Okay, let's tie it back to Lyft. So you went to the recruiting fair, you had the interviews, you were hired, but you were not hired as anything to do with localization, right? Because at that time, they didn't know anything about localization.
That's right. The way I like to put it, Lyft was originally built for one language, one country, one currency, which had its advantages. Certainly allowed Lyft to grow really quickly because there wasn't a lot of attention being paid to that, which was fine, for the time being. So being in the United States, they definitely grew a lot faster for a significant period of time than Uber here in the United States. Then eventually, I think either late 2017 or 2018, I can't remember, Lyft launched in Toronto as the first Canadian city. And so that was a lot of the work that was done to solve the country and the currency issue to be able to operate in Canada.
So when you mentioned the first Canadian city, was that the first city abroad?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and Lyft still only operates in the US and Canada at the moment. So,
right.
But yeah, so when I got hired, it was just a support associate answering phones and emails from riders and drivers, trying to resolve their issues anywhere from, a driver got into an accident on the more serious side to I didn't get my $5 credit, give me free money. And I just say, sure, here's some credit, and move on. But I was able to incorporate some of my Spanish skills because there was only me and one other person on the team at the time that had the skills in Spanish to be able to answer emails and phone calls in Spanish. And so we didn't get too many messages. I'd say about 80 emails a week in Spanish, but it was pretty much me and this one other person that were handling all of that. So I always tried to find ways to use the skills and my passion, which is really Spanish language, to try and apply that to whatever the role I was currently in.
Okay. And how did that lead to localization?
Okay. So after spending a year on support, answering Spanish emails, I was approached by someone on the operations team to help manage markets. Basically, this person wanted to move to another team, but they needed to find a replacement. And so they were managing Chicago, Miami, Atlanta. And again, this was very early at Lyft. When I joined as an employee, I was probably employee like 250, maybe between 200, 250. So it was still pretty early considering the company's, thousands of people now. So when I was on support, someone approached me to join operations to manage these markets remotely. And seeing that it was Miami, again, that's another opportunity to use Spanish language skills, considering it's a heavily Spanish-speaking market. So I moved on to operations for a year, helped manage those markets, grow those markets in terms of rides, get more drivers on the road, more people taking rides. And so after about a year of that, I got pulled onto the competitive intelligence team because not only was I a Lyft driver, I was also an Uber driver. So people would ask me, hey, what's going on with Uber? What are they doing with this? What promotion? What coupon are they dropping? And so eventually I was pulled onto that team to be able to grow a network to collect competitive intelligence and do analysis and pass it along to the team that was looking for insight into different parts of the competitive platform, which, at the time being only in the US was just Uber.
Were you driving Uber while you were an employee of Lyft?
I was.
Oh, really?
Both. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there was nothing against it, and it was really valuable. I don't mind saying it now that I'm done with it, but at the time there was nothing against it. So I was able to gather some valuable information from being a driver for both. So
how was it like? Like driving for the competition? Like, did you feel like they do a lot of things differently, better, worse?
Honestly, and I'll say it with love for Lyft in my heart. I will always be part of the Lyft family. Even though I don't work there anymore. Uber did have a lot of parts of their app and product and experience that were superior. And I think that came from being around longer. Even though Lyft was first to do peer-to-peer, so actual people driving their own cars, picking people up, Uber did have 3 years on them in terms of app development and platform development, because they had the professional drivers like the black car drivers. And then once Lyft came on the scene, they launched UberX, and that was the direct competitor. So, I think there was a lot of things that Uber was better at, but I think that's why they asked me to join the competitive team, to find out what those things are, pass them along, so we can learn from them, and Lyft could do it better. So yeah, no, it was an interesting experience, and then of course talking to riders as well about why do you choose Uber? Like why do you choose Uber instead of Lyft? And gathering that information and then sending it back to the consumer insights team, stuff like that. So yeah, it was a valuable way for me to contribute to the team that I was on at the time.
When we had our intro call, we talked about one of the topics that we wanted to talk about was data and how to utilize data. So what you were doing at that time was basically bringing the data, right, about competition. So I'm wondering, did you see any action taking on the data that you brought in? Like, what was better about Uber versus Lyft? Or was it like a black hole, which sometimes the users feel like that, like when they submit a feedback that it never gets done?
Yeah, definitely not a black hole. I think from an external perspective, it may feel like that, but I think the feedback and pieces of information and intelligence that I was able to gather were definitely taken into consideration. Now, were all of them implemented? No, because there's certainly an amount of prioritization that happens, and the idea that Lyft wants to do their own thing, they want to forge their own trail, and that's fine. I'm totally fine with that. Because at the end of the day, it was up to me to provide the information. It wasn't up to me to actually build the product itself. But I will say one thing that was very actionable and that I was able to have direct influence was collecting driver incentives. So part of my role on competitive intelligence was to build a network locally. So not just in San Francisco, but across all cities that Lyft and Uber operated, to collect driver incentives. So, for example, in Chicago, there might be, if a driver gives 20 rides, they get a $25 bonus, something like that. Mm-hmm. So collecting that information from as many sources as possible, synthesizing that data into saying, okay, we had 10 drivers that got this offer and 10 drivers that got that offer, and then passing that along to the local team or the people that are making the decisions on what incentives Lyft is going to offer. Knowing what the competition is doing, we can match or beat that, depending on whether or not we need more drivers out there. So that was something that was I brought to the table and was absolutely able to take action on, even so much as down to the specific hour, like knowing which hours incentives were available, and then having Lyft offer a similar or greater incentive if we decided that's the strategy we wanted to use at the time. So I'd say that was definitely a way that some competitive data we collected and then implementing it almost immediately.
Okay, so there you are driving for the competition, giving the information to Lyft. Is the next step localization? In
an indirect sense, yes. While I was working on the competitive team, almost the entire time I had spent at Lyft, I had been advocating for a Spanish language experience. Ever since I was on support, people would a lot of times write in because they didn't understand what the experience was. Now, there's a lot of other languages I think would have been helpful, but my strong suit is Spanish, and in the United States, Spanish is the second most spoken language besides.
When you mentioned that the people didn't understand the experience, are you talking about like new customers or maybe the drivers? Or I'm
mainly talking about drivers, because if you think about it, from a passenger or rider perspective, you open up the Lyft app, you put where you're going, you press a button, someone comes and picks you up, and you really are only interacting with the app for a few minutes. On the driver's side, sometimes they're driving for 8, 10, 12 hours at a time. So it's a much more in-depth experience for a longer period of time that the driver is having with the app than the rider. So that's why I think there was more emphasis on the driver experience. So yeah, there was a lot of times drivers wouldn't understand, like I mentioned with incentives, like a bonus or something, they'd get an email, it'd be in English and they wouldn't understand it because they didn't understand English as much as they did, say, Spanish. So almost the entire time I've been advocating for getting a Spanish language experience. And there were, it was a long process of talking to the right people. And because I started the company so early, I was able to interact with people that were pretty high up, like directors and VPs and even the co-founders. I got a good chance to interact with them. There was like a Shark Tank type event that we had where we each, there was teams that pitched ideas, and the idea that I pitched was Lyft Latino. And this was about 6 to 8 months before we actually launched a Spanish language experience. But that's what I pitched, and we won. Our team won because the executives realized that it was absolutely something that needed to happen in order to facilitate growth at the company. So yeah, it was just, I would say for about 5 to 6 months, I was doing double work because once they decided to localize the app into Spanish, there was a huge effort that got kicked off that it touched almost every team at the company. And I think that's not really a secret. If you're going to go from one language, the hardest part is going from 1 to 2 languages.
Right.
Then going from 2 to however many more is a lot easier. But the 1 to 2 was the really hard one. So while I was working on the competitive team, on the side, I was doing extra work to help facilitate the creation of the localized experience in Spanish for Lyft. So when the time came to permanently put people on that team to maintain it, that's when several people in the room, when they were deciding, said, "Hey, this guy's been doing it for the last 6 months. Let's give him a shot." And yeah, that's how I found myself finally officially on the localization team. Finally, I know. After 4 years, it had been, I had been at the company for a little over 4 years when I finally was able to work officially in localization. And so, yeah, I joined as a project manager. So we had a program manager and a Spanish language manager at the time in the beginning. And yeah, so it was really up to me to manage more internal stakeholders and not so much with the vendors, translation vendors or TMS vendors to start, but definitely if someone needed something translated or they had questions about translation, I was really the person that they would go to help answer their questions when I first joined the localization team.
Yes, I was so excited that we finally reached the localization point in your career, but I still want to go actually back because I have some questions here. When you were talking about like the Spanish speaking users that they didn't understand the app, mm-hmm. Did you have any data at that point? Or did Lyft have data about like how many people could be Spanish speaking?
Yeah, so it was pretty easy for us to tell, just based on device language. That's how we could tell whether or not the person would probably prefer Spanish. And it's interesting because I think there's a little bit of a misconception about someone that maybe can speak English pretty well, that they can understand written English without any issues. And so, reading and comprehension is much different than speaking. So, we felt that if someone's phone was in Spanish, then they probably would have preferred that Spanish experience. So it was pretty easy for us to pull data because we were already collecting a decent amount of data from the riders and the driver's phone. So we already knew what the percentage of users that were using Lyft in English with a Spanish device.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that for you it was like a personal thing because you were so good with Spanish. but were the Spanish speakers like on top of the list of using different language than English?
Yes.
In your data, right?
Yep. And I would say it definitely varied by market. Different markets had different languages that were third or fourth or fifth.
Mm-hmm.
So the vast majority of markets in the U.S. had Spanish as their second language behind English. But then you look at a city like Boston, where there's a very large Portuguese-speaking population. That definitely popped up. Then you look at New York, you've got Chinese and Russian that had very significant portions of users that had their device in those languages. Spanish was by far number 2 behind English, but there were certainly some other languages behind Spanish that had some significant percentage points of riders and drivers.
If we can, by any chance, go back to the Shark Tank moment where you were pitching the idea, basically the inception of localization at Lyft, right?
Yes.
How did you convince them, especially the managers? Because, you can say that, I understand Spanish. Maybe my friends and drivers, they're Spanish, and it would be nice if they understood the app in the language. But then the people with the money or the managers, they can say okay, so what? They are already driving with us. How do you justify this, I would say, sort of a big decision?
Yeah. That's a great question. So there were a handful of data points, and they were very rough because, in a Shark Tank situation, it was almost like, I don't want to call it a hackathon because there was no coding involved, but it was very much get people in a room for a few hours and then come up with something. So I don't think we weren't expected to have, really specific pieces of data to go on. It was more generalized. So we looked at the competition, I think, was number 1. Uber at the time was localized into 25, 30 languages, and it was very much preferred among non-English speakers because of the fact they offered a localized experience. So I think that was number 1. Number 2, I looked at pure population numbers in the United States. There was at the time there were 40 plus million Spanish speakers in the United States, which makes it the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world, behind Mexico. Mexico's number 1, and then there's more Spanish speakers in the United States than there are in Spain, which is kind of crazy.
Cheers to Javi.
I know, right? And there was another data point too, looking at smartphone usage among the Hispanic population versus other ethnic demographics, which actually skewed higher. So that was another piece that we brought in, that you're more likely to be using a smartphone more frequently if you are of Hispanic descent. Also, we looked at purchasing power. I mean, these were like Pew Research, public type research numbers that we were pulling in. We looked at purchasing power, and we looked at the growth of the Hispanic population in the U.S. And these were all data points that we came up with to pitch to the executives. And it was a powerhouse. I mean, the panel was the CMO, the CEO, the COO, the creative director. I mean, that's who was judging us. And so it was really a great opportunity to be able to be in front of those people and to have an audience. And then when we won, I got a chance to have a 15-minute conversation about it with the CEO of the company and the president. There's a lot of co-founders at Lyft, but the 2 that are still there, John and Logan, being able to have a conversation with them for 10 to 15 minutes about this and then to get to know me, was, definitely one of the high points of my career.
What I'm thinking right now is, you mentioned, what was interesting and surprising to me was that you mentioned that at that time, Uber was already localized into 20 or 25 languages, you mentioned?
I don't know the exact number, but they went international in 2011. I mean, they were already, Paris, I think, was their first international market. So before Lyft even launched, they were already international.
I see.
They had a huge head start on their translation and localization program. And I think as far as brand awareness, Lyft has definitely come around. But when you have people that, maybe are immigrants, or they're not as aware of other ride shares in the US, they're going to go, if something's in their language, they're going to go with that. And for a lot of languages, that was Uber. So I think Uber has 40 languages now, at least on their website. So I think at the time it was quite a few, a lot more than Lyft, that's for sure.
Did you or the company feel like the lack of localization is, let's say, hindering the growth of the company? Like it could be the key? Or was it more like making it a better experience for the people who are already using it?
Well, I always felt that it was a growth lever. Absolutely. I firmly believe and continue to believe that having an experience that is able to be in that person's language is going to be sticky. They're going to keep coming back, and it's going to get new people to join. Convincing other people of that, not so easy. I think people did see it as something that was a nice to have, maybe a little bit more than a nice to have. Just I don't know. It's hard to explain. I think some people, yes, they saw it as a growth lever the way I did, and other people were like, yes, but not to the extent that would be worth really moving forward and localizing into all of these languages. I think some people conflate internationalization with localization. And whenever I started talking to a certain group of people, sometimes it would inevitably be, well, we're not going international. Why are we doing other languages? And, I needed to remind them that we're in the United States. There's a significant population of people that speak other languages, millions of people. And so, I could go, there's a long list of data points that I tried to put together, or that I did put together to try and convince people to do quite a few languages, even putting dollar amounts of on it. But at the end of the day, it wasn't enough for them to prioritize it the way that I would have liked.
How do you go from bartending and driving a car to presenting data points? Is it something that you picked up, or how did you, get to that point where you knew you need data to prove a point or to convince someone?
That is definitely something I picked up. I had never worked in tech before I worked at Lyft. I had worked at an office as an office manager at a roofing company before I went to college to finish my degree in Spanish. So I had some experience working in an office, but as far as data and convincing people, I had to pick that up. That was definitely something that I learned almost completely at Lyft. One thing that I thought was really funny in the very beginning, I joined and I was like, oh my God, I'm working at this company. It's growing really fast. It's pretty amazing. Everyone must know how to do everything, and everyone must be just geniuses to be able to know. And the more I got to know people, and the more I started to understand, not to say everyone I worked with, for the most part, super smart, super talented, but I came to the realization of they are still also trying to figure it out. I'm trying to figure out some things. They're trying to figure out what they're doing. And because they're, great at what they do, they figure it out. But at the same time, they don't always have all the answers. And so once I figured that out, I think I felt okay with not knowing things, asking the questions, building the relationships with people, and then learning from them and asking them for guidance, and not feeling bad that I didn't know something. So yeah, as far as that, learning how to convince people and that data is what drives decisions, that is definitely something that I had to learn on the fly at Lyft.
You talk about learning and adjusting to things. So how did you learn localization? Because, another thing that was surprising to me was that you were the guy who, let's say, pitched the idea, and let's say you and your team convinced the company to start exploring localization. But then you told me that there were other program managers or somebody else. I thought that you were actually the one who was starting the whole thing. So they brought in some people with experience, and then you joined the team. And
yes. So I had been at the company a lot longer than other people. So I think people knew me as someone who wanted to advocate for localization. But I have to credit the program manager who came in, who had a lot of experience. His name is Brian McConnell. Really, really great guy, really knowledgeable, really knows his stuff about localization. And I credit where I am today because of the knowledge that he gave me. So even though I was the one that pitched that Shark Tank about having a localized experience, he was the one that did most of the work in the beginning to set it up, hire a TMS, build that relationship, work with engineering to connect our code base to the TMS. Like I didn't know how to do things like that. And he did. And he taught me, even though that wasn't necessarily his role. His role was to build localization. But, I forced my way in. I continued to ask him and hound him, and he was super nice about it and really gave me the guidance that I needed to understand localization enough to be able to join the team. It was actually really funny. Going back to the Shark Tank, one thing I want to mention, one of the people was the VP of rideshare, or the VP. It was one of the VPs of engineering was on that panel with the COO and the CEO. And as I'm going through the presentation, at the end, I'm like, okay, translate the app and then do marketing and then launch Spanish experience. And in the question and answer, he's like, well, do you think it'll be difficult to translate the app? Do you think you'll need engineering resources? And I was like, nah, probably not that much. I think it'll be fine. We can get like a vendor and like there's a company we could just hire to do that. And he didn't challenge me on it. He was just like, oh, okay. and I appreciate him not doing that. And, after going through the process and understanding the huge amount of effort that needed from the engineering standpoint that I had no idea, me being naive at the time, it's a funny thing for me to look back on to know that I hadn't, to understand I had no idea what it actually took. But he was very nice about it. And at the same time, it wasn't an engineering event. It was more of an operation idea type event. So I think it was very nice of him not to challenge me on it. So anyways, just a fun memory from that experience.
Did the localization effort start without you? Like, did they first hire the experienced people and then you joined the team, or were you part of the team from the start?
They hired other people before I officially joined the team. Like I mentioned before, I was doing kind of double work. So I was unofficially working on the localization effort. So yeah, I was not the first person to be on the localization team. I joined close to when a lot of the work was finished and they were preparing for launch, was when I officially joined the team. But I had been working with them in an unofficial capacity for about 6 months before that.
When you joined the team, what was the state of localization at the time?
Like when I officially joined the team?
Mm-hmm.
It was almost done. The translation pipeline had been built and was being tested. Most of the content across web and app had been translated into Spanish. So there was a lot of testing going on. We were probably 2 to 3 months out from launch when I officially joined the team. So a lot of the work that I had done unofficially was to kind of create workflows and visualize workflows on how things were going to work. So then when I joined the team, it was up to me to take those workflows that I had created and then implement them and maintain them. And, just very simple of like an engineer checks in a new string. That string is then imported to the TMS. Then in the TMS, vendor number 1 does the translation. Vendor number 1 does the editing. Vendor number 2 does the review. Then once the review, it moves to published. Then the translation pipeline pulls it back into the code base, and it gets stored in a repository. And then when someone opens up the app with their phone in Spanish, they see the Spanish string instead of the English string. Creating and visualizing those workflows, not actually doing the engineering work, but just showing how it works to other people at the company, so that when they want to know how localization works, they have a visual guide to be able to do that. So that was a lot of the work that I was doing before I joined. And when I actually joined, I took that and then ran with it and continued to show that to other people at the company, so that they could understand how we were going to run things.
You mentioned that you started as a project manager, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I joined the team as a project manager, working under Brian as the program manager. And then there was also another Spanish language manager at the time that was overseeing the linguistic quality and working closely with vendors to make sure that the translations were right, as well as maintaining glossary terms, editing glossary terms, and really finding our voice in Spanish, and making sure that was complete and consistent.
Did you know anything about project management, or was it another thing that you had to pick up on your own?
So I had done a lot of it on the competitive team. Even though I think my title was, God, I had this really cryptic title. I was like a strategy analyst or something, or strategic something, local insights strategy specialist, but I mean, I was a program and project manager. Basically, I had the local competitive insights program that I was managing, and because I was the only person at the time, I was the program and the project manager. So I took that experience from the competitive team and was able to shift that over to localization.
So you mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, that you joined 2 months before the launch, right?
Just about, yeah.
So to me, this is like a big thing, I would imagine. So what was like the atmosphere or the expectations from the company and from the team, like before the launch, and how did the launch go, and what did you, or yes, okay, let's start with those questions before I dump all the ideas on you.
Yeah, I think based on the way we set up a test, like a holdout group, we were going to launch to a percentage of Spanish users and hold out a percentage to be able to see if there was a difference.
Right.
Like any test, to be able to see if it was actually driving incrementality. Were riders taking more rides? Were new users signing up more frequently? Were drivers driving more often? Were they earning more? Were they getting higher ratings? And the answer was yes on all of those. I can't share specific numbers, but statistically significant numbers in several of those categories that we saw a positive lift, pardon the pun, in actual in the data. And so that was the expectation, was that if we were going to spend the money and maintain a localized experience, we should be able to see some level of incrementality from our rider and driver population and new user acquisition as well. So yeah, I think some of the key metrics that we saw increases were drivers were getting higher ratings, they were driving more frequently, new users were activating, so that's actually taking a ride. They were activating at a higher rate than the holdout. Drivers were making more money because they were driving more. So those are really some of the key metrics that we saw when we launched a new language. What was even better is, because I had that data from Spanish, when I wanted to advocate for other languages farther down the line, I was able to use those numbers as a proxy to say, okay, here's the population of Spanish drivers. We saw this lift. Now, if we did this for Portuguese, we'd expect to see the same lift. here's the dollar numbers that it means if we launch this language. So it was really important for us to get that data in the very beginning to be able to have that in our pocket when we wanted to launch other languages.
Did you also try to collect qualitative data, like surveys from the users, how they feel about it, or was it mostly quant?
It was mostly quant, mainly due to resourcing. I would have loved to have collected some qualitative data, but the consumer insights team, I think, wasn't really equipped, or it wasn't a priority for them to collect qualitative data around the experience. So we really did have to rely on quantitative data there.
You know, what I like when you mentioned that when you launched, you already had this sort of plan of what kind of metrics you want to see impact on through the localization. Once you started, like once the localization program started to be more mature, did you add some more metrics into it, or did you like handpick certain metrics among all those data? You know, like you can collect a lot of data, but like for the localization program, what was the important data?
I think we mainly stuck with the ones that we saw from the Spanish launch. Mm-hmm. It was tough because the other languages that we ended up launching, like right now, Lyft is available in Spanish, Brazilian Portuguese, and Canadian French. It was difficult to get a large enough audience in those languages to really get statistically significant data. With Spanish, it was easy because there were enough drivers and riders to be able to gather that data over a certain period of time. So for the other languages, at least in the United States, we just didn't have enough of a sample size to be able to get a significant read on it. So we really relied on the same metrics for those languages. And just as opposed to coming up with new ones. So yeah, I there was other. I tried to do some other comparisons as well. For example, I got my hands on a competitive data set around different devices that have. We looked at keyboard language on Android devices, primary, secondary, tertiary keyboard languages. And then we could also see, it was all anonymized, like what apps they had installed. So, and there's a lot of companies out there that do app data analysis. So we looked at who has the Uber app and the Lyft app and the Uber driver versus Lyft driver by market, and, seeing what percentage of people based on keyboard language. And you could see there was a lot of under-indexing of Lyft versus Uber in a lot of markets, even for Spanish. So I think that was one thing I tried to, because as soon as we launched Spanish, I wanted to launch a bunch of other languages. I tried to make the case for that. Then looking at running Spanish language ads, seeing if on Facebook, seeing if we could get Spanish users to activate at a higher rate or at a cheaper acquisition cost. I can't really go into details on numbers on that, but it was a fairly successful test. And so that was, another piece of data there. And something close to home for you, at least in Vancouver, trying to make the case for Chinese. There's a very large Chinese population in Vancouver. And trying to show that not only would we be behind Uber if because they basically launched at the same time, but there would be a significant lift in revenue if we did launch with Chinese. Ended up not moving forward with it, unfortunately, but those were the kinds of cases that we tried to build as we tried to push localization forward.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point that you mentioned that you were then testing the localized ads. So what was the initial scope for the launch? Was it just the app?
App and website. So the website, there's a content management system, a third-party content management system that integrated with the translation management system that made the website pretty easy to localize. And then the app was, using a REST API with the TMS to hook up to GitHub.
So when we're talking about the data and the matrix, you mentioned, to me, it was mostly like a business matrix, like the data that you would present to outsiders. But what were the data that you were tracking inside as the team? Like when it comes to, for example, performance of the vendors, or like the translation turnaround time, the quality. Maybe we can talk a little bit about those kind of data.
Yeah. When we had a Spanish language manager, he was the final say for quality. He was doing the review. He was reviewing all of the Spanish translation. So it would go to the vendor, it'd get translated, it would get edited if needed, and then he'd be the review. So it was very easy to track quality because it was a person doing it. Eventually, there was a shift in priorities, unfortunately, and they shifted the team to be just one person, just me. And that's when I moved from project to program manager and ran the whole thing. But, we relied very heavily on our vendors to manage the quality themselves. There was an internal ticketing system where if someone saw an error, they would be able to report it. And if it was a localization error, there was a specific project in Jira. The Jira ticket would come to me, and I'd be able to handle it. There was a handful of people using the Lyft beta app that if they saw something, they'd be able to flag an issue pretty easily. So overall, I think there could have been more attention paid to quality, but because of resourcing, there just wasn't. It just wasn't there to have it be as good as it could be. It was fine. I mean, that we were able to catch a significant amount of errors, but we really did rely heavily on the vendor for quality assurance. And we worked with some really great vendors. I was really thankful to have, I'll name drop them because I love them so much. Mother Tongue. I don't know if you've heard of them before. They're part of a larger group called Omnicom, which is a big, marketing conglomerate. But Mother Tongue was really, really great. In their translation, transcreation, they took the time to understand the Lyft voice and really went deep. In fact, so much so because we came up with this program where we actually brought the translators on site, and this is probably the thing that I'm maybe the most proud of in terms of the localization experience and program. We actually were able to get approval from Lyft to bring the translators on site. And I mean, we brought them from around the world, from Brazil, from Montreal, from Mexico City. They came to Lyft headquarters, spent several days with me and the rest of the team in the very beginning, and were able to get their questions answered and also just kind of integrate into the Lyft culture and for them to see how the company operated. I gave them a tour of the office. We had, Lyft at the time had cars that you could take out and do like practice Lyft rides if you wanted to actually go out and do rides in a car. So, we pretended I was driving. They would sit in the passenger seat. They would pretend to be the driver. Another linguist in the back seat would pretend to be the passenger. They'd switch. So they'd be able to see how the app actually functioned in English. And it wasn't, it was tough, like especially being not in the US. There was no way for them to see how it actually worked unless they had been to the US and taken rides. So giving them a chance to come and talk to us directly and ask questions and get the experience of what it means to be a driver and a rider, that really, really helped us in terms of setting them up for success with quality down the line. So that was definitely something that I recommend. It wasn't cheap, but I absolutely think it was totally worth it. And I even came up with some metrics on, based on the cost of travel and how much time it would be, and I really broke it down. I said, look, it's going to cost us this much to bring him here. If we see this amount of incrementality from improved translations, it's going to be worth it. And it was something ridiculously small. It was like a fraction of a percent because of the scale that Lyft was operating at. All we needed to do was have this amount of incrementality to make it worth it. And that absolutely got us the approval to bring him on site. So that was just a really great experience in general. And that built the relationships with those linguists directly, because you don't see that a lot, actually. You don't see translation vendors letting clients have direct access to translators. That's usually something where they separate. Mother Tongue was amazing in the fact that they let us have that direct contact. They came on site, and we brought Mother Tongue, our project managers, on site too. And so they were able to really embed with us at the company at Lyft and just really understand what we wanted to do and how we wanted to do it. So, yeah, that was a very long-winded answer for how we dealt with quality. We set them up in the very beginning with the tools that they needed and built the relationships from the very beginning so that there were fewer quality issues down the line.
I may be mistaking here, but going to where you are right now at Netflix, I think Netflix is one of the teams that still has some in-house linguists, right? I don't know if it's for all languages or maybe just for some languages.
I don't think there's in-house linguists.
Oh, okay.
I think so. There's a team of language managers that have different regions or different locales that they oversee. That are a lot of them are speakers of that language. I would say there's not a language manager for every single language. Some of the language managers oversee multiple regions, in Europe or in APAC. So there is quite a large vendor pool that Netflix does pull from. But the language management team is pretty large as well. But no, I don't think there's in-house linguists that are being used.
The reason why I ask this is I was thinking that if we can compare like what you did for Lyft, bringing the people on board with Netflix. And I thought like maybe we don't need to do it because like Netflix already does it, but okay, I guess I was wrong. But the thing is, like you mentioned that for Lyft, like the people in outside of the countries, they couldn't use Lyft app, but for Netflix, they can use it. So do you think like, let's say at Netflix, it would still be beneficial for people to spend some time with the team and to absorb the culture? Or you think like Netflix is such a global phenomenon that people already know like what Netflix is and how Netflix communicates?
I think it's the latter. I don't want to say that it wouldn't be beneficial, because I think any relationship building at all, just in my career and in general, that's definitely a piece of advice I would give people is build the relationships with people, and that's what's going to lead to success. So sure, I think there would be some benefits for bringing linguists on site and meeting the actual engineers that they're translating strings for. Would it be as beneficial? No, I don't think so, because Netflix is so accessible globally that it's very easy to get the same experience on your computer anywhere than it is if you're in a specific location. So I don't think it would be nearly as beneficial to a service like Netflix that it was for Lyft.
I'm curious about the relationship that you mentioned. I would assume that in your experience, you had some underperformers. How do you handle that relationship when you see that the people really don't cut it for you?
Underperformers from a translation quality standpoint?
Or project managers or...
Well, I don't really have an experience like that at Netflix yet. I'm still very new. I'll definitely say that I'm coming up on 3 months at Netflix. And at Lyft, didn't really see a lot of underperforming from our internal team at all. The only reason why the team was downsized was due to priorities. Certainly had nothing to do with performance. We were all pretty amazing at what we did. As far as linguistic quality and vendor quality, there was a time where we had some difficulty with Spanish language translation quality from a vendor, and we ended up having to move on from them. And that was a difficult conversation. I think we gave them, a decent amount of feedback and a chance to improve, and we just weren't seeing it. And we ended up having to switch content over. And I think that's a good lesson for don't put all your eggs in one basket. Definitely have multiple vendors in your program so that if you have an issue with one, and this isn't anything against that vendor. They're a pretty large vendor. They have a lot of clients. I think it was more just an unfortunate situation. So I don't hold any grudge or any ill will towards them, but it just wasn't working out for us, and we ended up having to move on. So it's not an easy conversation to have, but it is important to read the signs, read the signals, and if you need to make a switch, make a switch. There's a lot of quality translation vendors out there, and if one's not working for you, there's probably another one that will.
Was it the decision of the language manager that you mentioned? Because you said that he was doing all the reviews. So was it feedback from him, input from him, or data from him, or was it from some other vendors?
It was mostly from our internal language manager at the time. It was ultimately the program manager who made the decision and had that conversation. But it was all of us together when we finally cut the cord. But yes, it was our internal Spanish language manager who had been reporting feedback, recording specific instances of lower quality, and that was ultimately why we decided to move to a different vendor.
Okay, so let me get this right. So you were part of a team, and then suddenly it was just you. Was it really like a sudden thing, or was it planned, or?
No, it was very sudden. It was very, very sudden. It was almost overnight, pretty much. In my opinion, it was not executed very well. I think there could have been better communication, but that was the decision that was made at the company. It was very bittersweet for me because the people that I had been working with for the last year plus were suddenly gone, and I was moved into a role I was promoted into a role to run the whole thing. So. It was a step forward for me, but the people that I owed a lot of my success to were not there, and it was very sad. I was not happy about it. Again, I think bittersweet is probably the best way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
But removing emotion from it and understanding that it's a business and this is the business decision. That it was not a personal decision. I think that helped, but it was very sudden. To answer your question, it happened. It happened really fast.